Hi, it's Patrick Hutzel from IntensiveCareHotline.com, where we instantly improve the lives of families of critically ill patients in intensive care, so that you can have peace of mind, real power, real control, and so that you can influence decision making fast, even if you're not a doctor or a nurse in intensive care. In last week's podcast, I interviewed Andy from the UK, and Andy shared his story, or more or less his partner's story, who was in intensive care with a bleed on the brain. You can listen to last week's podcast with our special guest Andy by clicking on the link below this video. The podcast is really inspirational because Andy shares his story from where his partner basically came back from her deathbed in intensive care, and she's now in rehab. Really worthwhile listening to this interview. In this week's blog, I want to share with you the 5 reasons why you need to get involved in decision making in intensive care. If your loved one is critically ill in intensive care, chances are that you and your family feel like you've lost control over your and your loved one's life. You feel like the intensive care team has the upper hand and is making many crucial and often life or death decisions without actually really talking to you or explaining to you the very crucial insider knowledge that leads to those decisions. The intensive care team feels like fish in water, and you and your family feel like fish out of water, meaning you and your family are completely outside of your comfort zone and you are extremely vulnerable. The intensive care team is making many decisions without often sitting down with you and your family so that you really understand what's happening. In the meantime, your levels of stress, your fears, your frustrations, your anxieties, and your level of vulnerability have all but gone through the roof. The fear of the unknown and other people running the show is what is the most frustrating to you, as well as not knowing what the next few days or even the next few hours have in store for you. But especially with this lack of communication from the intensive care team and explaining to you in detail when your loved one is either very unstable and in a very critical condition, or is in a life-threatening situation, or is in intensive care for long-term treatments and long-term stays, or is having a severe or traumatic head or brain injury, or is threatened with an NFR, not for resuscitation, or DNR, do not resuscitate order, or is in a situation where the intensive care team suggests a withdrawal of treatment or a limitation of treatment as being quote-unquote in the best interest of your critically ill loved one. Or your critically ill loved one may even be approaching their end of life in intensive care. In those situations, you can't afford to passively sit on the sidelines and watch an event go by that could potentially cost the life of your critically ill loved one. You can't potentially be doing what 99% of families of critically ill patients in intensive care are doing, who don't question, who don't challenge, and as a direct result of their inaction don't have any peace of mind, control, power, or influence. You really need to get involved, and you need to get as much information as possible in a very short period of time. This is possible with all the information we provide at IntensiveCareHotline.com. The truth of the matter is that intensive care teams are often not transparent in their dealings with families, and they often hide behind their medical jargon and their medical terminologies. They often do this for very good reasons, and mainly because there are just simply too many things happening behind the scenes in intensive care that almost always impact on how the intensive care team frames and positions your critically ill loved one's prognosis, diagnosis, and their treatment. After all, intensive care teams are the smart ones, right? Well, I'm glad you've asked. With the rise of the internet and with the rise of having so much information at your disposal, even in such highly specialized areas like intensive care, you can now flip the coin, and you can now relatively easily turn the tables in your favor if you are prepared to do your own research. And that's exactly why it's so important, and that's exactly why you need to get involved in decision making in intensive care when your loved one is critically ill in intensive care. In fact, there are 5 distinct reasons why you need to get involved in decision making in intensive care when your loved one's critically ill. Number 1. The stuff that's happening behind the scenes in intensive care is too powerful to ignore and almost always impacts on how the intensive care team frames and positions your critically ill loved one's prognosis, diagnosis and their treatment. It's therefore that you can't afford to ignore what's happening behind the scenes in intensive care. Intensive care is a very intriguing and dynamic place, and the stuff you don't see, the stuff that's happening behind the scenes in intensive care, 9 times out of 10 always impacts in how the intensive care team frames and positions your critically ill loved one's prognosis, diagnosis and treatment. So, what does that mean? It means that the minute your critically ill loved one is either very unstable and in a very critical condition, or is in a life-threatening situation, or is in intensive care for long-term treatments and long-term stays, or is having a severe or traumatic head or brain injury, or is threatened with an NFR, not for resuscitation, or DNR, do not resuscitate order, or is in a situation where the intensive care team suggests a withdrawal of treatment or a limitation of treatment as being in the best interest of your critically ill loved one, or your loved one may even be approaching the end of life in intensive care. That's the minute where the tension is very high within intensive care teams and within families of critically ill patients. You and your family have no idea that the politics, the hierarchy, the fight for limited resources, the big egos of some doctors, the psychology, the dynamics and the intrigue behind the scenes in intensive care almost always impacts on how the intensive care team frames and positions your critically ill loved one's prognosis, diagnosis and their treatment. There are just too many competing interests in intensive care that compete and fight for their attention, that if you don't know, if you don't understand, and if you don't learn what's happening behind the scenes in intensive care, you will stand no chance in winning this uphill battle. The intensive care team knows how to play this quote-unquote high-stakes game, and they know how to win in order to get what they want. Number 2. Intensive care teams often don't feel the need to be open and transparent and explain things in a language that you and your family can understand. Intensive care teams often hide behind their medical jargon. They hide behind being the smart ones, without actually making the effort to compassionately and empathetically explain the very things that are happening with your critically ill loved one in a language and in a way that you can understand easily so that you can relate. If you search on the internet for information about intensive care, you'll find research papers written from doctors for doctors. Unlike intensivecarehotline.com, where you find information about intensive care that you understand, research papers have no purpose to make the information palatable, transparent and patient and family friendly. Thankfully, you have come to the right place if your loved one is critically ill in intensive care, because we at intensivecarehotline.com have information available for you that is written and spoken in a patient and family friendly language that you can understand. No hiding behind medical jargon. We give it all to you so that you can have peace of mind, control, power and influence really quickly. Number 3. Family meetings in intensive care are often being used to again frame and position your critically ill loved one's prognosis and diagnosis if you don't know how to position yourself correctly. If your loved one is critically ill in intensive care and you are confronted with the challenging, unpleasant and dire circumstances, 9 times out of 10 the intensive care team will ask you for a formal family meeting. Whenever the intensive care team is asking you and your family for a formal family meeting, the intensive care team often uses those meetings to quote-unquote cement their often negative positioning, and they often use their perceived power and their perceived authority to consciously or unconsciously know that they are the ones calling the shots or running the show. 99% of families of critically ill patients in intensive care have no peace of mind, no control, no power and no influence, because they either don't question, they don't do their own research, and they are either ill or unprepared when it comes to family meetings with the intensive care team. Often, families of critically ill patients in intensive care get walked all over by the all-powerful intensive care team in family meetings because they don't know how to correctly position their critically ill loved one's situation. In a unique and once-in-a-lifetime situation where you are having a loved one critically ill in intensive care, you can't afford to get the things wrong, and you need to very quickly get a handle on things without being run over by the intensive care team. Number 4. Intensive care units often have hidden agendas and interests that go way beyond your critically ill loved one's prognosis, diagnosis and treatment. Intensive care teams often have hidden agendas, again, that go way beyond your critically ill loved one's prognosis, diagnosis and treatment. Therefore, intensive care teams have interests that more often than not focus on the financial interests of the intensive care units or the hospital. For example, do they expect that they will make money or lose money when continuing to treat your critically ill loved one? Also, they're focused on bed management interests of the intensive care team and the hospital. For example, does the intensive care team have more admissions competing for scarce, expensive and in-demand and precious intensive care beds, and they therefore may suggest to stop or withdraw treatment for patients where they have no or a lesser interest in treating. Also, be mindful of medical research interests. Intensive care units often get 5, 6 or even 7-figure dollar funding per year for medical research. That means that critically ill patients in intensive care being enrolled in a medical research study may get preference compared to the ones who aren't. Your job is to be mindful of this, and your job is to check whether your critically ill loved one is enrolled in a medical research study, and if you and your loved one haven't given verbal or written consent. So be mindful of this, check it out and ask the intensive care team. Number 5. Intensive care teams are often negative and they try to diminish your hope. The number of times intensive care teams are negative, trying to diminish your hope, has come to a point where I think some doctors should start questioning their negative approach and their integrity. The bottom line is that where there's life, there's hope. Intensive care teams are almost always negative just simply because it helps them to cement their perceived power and their perceived authority. Being negative helps intensive care teams to drive their mainly hidden agenda, and it helps them to keep you and your family at arm's length. Being negative helps intensive care teams to make sure that you and your family don't become difficult and demanding. Being negative helps intensive care teams to prevent families from legally suing them in case they predict a positive outcome and then things don't work out as planned. Your job, as always, is to stay strong, stay positive and to do your own research so that you have peace of mind, control, power and influence. So, how can you stay strong, positive and do your own research and quickly get peace of mind, control, power and influence while your loved one is critically ill in intensive care? You get to that all-important feeling of peace of mind, control, power and influence when you download your free Instant Impact Report now by entering your email below. In your free Instant Impact Report, you learn quickly how to get peace of mind, real power and real control, and how you can influence decision making fast whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care. Your free instant impact report gives you in-depth insight that you must know whilst your loved one is critically ill or is even dying in intensive care. Sign up and download your free instant impact report now by entering your email below. In your free instant impact report, you learn how to speak the secret intensive care language so that the doctors and the nurses know straight away that you are an insider and that you know and understand what's really happening in intensive care. In your free report, you will also discover how to ask the doctors and the nurses the right questions. Discover the many competing interests in intensive care and how your critically ill loved one's treatment may depend on those competing interests. How to eliminate fear, frustration, stress, struggle and vulnerability even if your loved one is dying. You get 5 killer tips and strategies helping you to get on the right path to peace of mind, control, power and influence in your situation. You will get real-world examples that you can easily adapt to your and your critically ill loved one's situation. How to stop being intimidated by the intensive care team and how you will be seen as equals. You will get crucial behind-the-scenes insight so that you know and understand what's really happening in intensive care and how you need to manage doctors and nurses in intensive care, and it's not what you think. Thank you for tuning into this week's blog, and I'll see you again in another update next week. Make sure you also check out our Your Questions Answered section where we answer your questions, or send me an email to support@intensivecarehotline.com with your questions. Also check out our product section where you get more ebooks, videos and audio recordings, and where you can also get one-on-one consulting via Skype or over the phone. This is Patrick Hutzel from intensivecarehotline.com, and I'll see you again next week in another update.